As of February, this past February, 36 states in our country have either put forward or passed bills that have disallowed schools and other private groups to offer anything that looks like what they're calling critical race theory, but really any type of history that has to do with slavery, Reconstruction, and racial injustice. Critical race theory, as a sidebar, is a program that you will find only in advanced academia for those who are going to law school to look at systems and how systems have been crafted to benefit those of us of white skin. It is not taught in kindergarten. Florida is one of those states that has gone a bit further in that it has said that you cannot, as an educator or presenter or anything else within a school system or in a private enterprise, teach or present any material that will make a white person feel bad. I want to be very clear that I am not paraphrasing. And what this is doing is it is saying that our comfort is more important than the literal lives of people of color. Now, I've offered this before. I'm sure you've injected it somewhere too. But I bring it up today because after reading some of the material that you have read, you're probably wishing that that law applied to us. Because when you're reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree and you are reading it with integrity and reading it with attention, I have no doubt that so much of your foundation has been pulled out and so much of your emotions have been shaken that you are probably wishing that we never did it. So what I would like to do before we go any further is I want to hear how you are doing with this. Now, I want to just sort of give a brief summary, and by brief, I mean I'm going to do an incredible disservice by trying to summarize the chapter. Simply stated, the chapter is called Mary, Don't You Weep. It's looking at basically some of the historical context of women of African descent who have been involved in the civil rights movement, but even before that, movements to end slavery. And it is also graphic in its details of how people of color, specifically of African women and children, have been lynched. And by lynched, we mean tortured, maimed, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Okay? That is the essence of the chapter that was read. I can't come out of that without feeling sick to my stomach, emotionally distraught, and desirous of tucking my head back in the sand and pretending like all is right with the world. But I want to hear how you're doing. Anybody? David.
While it is true, that it is disgusting, distraught, and all those sad things, it is important that we, citizens, know the truth about our history. Without the truth, we cannot move forward to correct those things that we have done or been implicitly guilty of doing.
Thank you, David. And by those things, let's just summarize those and call it a sin. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Linda, and then Amy.
I want to commit a sin myself and go back and kill the people who did all this horrible stuff.
And by recognizing the intense anger that we may have towards those who we are seeing as the perpetrators of this injustice, we must also flip that coin. Linda is pointing to herself. Thank you very much. We must also flip that coin and recognize that without doing the work that David just called on us to do, we are continuing the legacy of perpetrating the same horrors. Yes, thank you.
I would say similar to what David said and what you said, Claire, that it's really harsh, but at the same time, I appreciate being made aware. I appreciate being educated about what has happened in our country that I did not know had happened in our country and still happens.
Thank you, Amy. Zoom? Nancy?
Nancy.
Nancy, we don't know if you're muted or not, or if you're typing. Nancy, you're still muted, dear. There we go.
She's typing.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Like Karima, I want to punch someone.
Like Karima, you want to punch someone.
We had that discussion yesterday.
I gotcha. Gotcha. And I want to appreciate the sense of wanting to lash out by also recognizing that we attempt to be nonviolent. Right? Attempt. But I want to come back to that in a minute.
Linda said, you said to be honest.
I did. And what I just said was a very white thing to say back to you. So that's why I want to come back to it. Go ahead. Anybody else?
So I just want to iterate, I guess, the piece that I'm really grabbing hold of is the consequences and the continuous consequences of these actions. Well, not consequences, but continuous playing out of this behavior, these actions, these atrocities towards Black people, and how much of that is due to not looking at it, the unwillingness to look at it, the unwillingness to recognize how real this is. At the retreat yesterday, Mallory put up a photo, and we were required to look at it and look at it and look at it of two Black boys or young men who were lynched, and one's head was decapitated. And there was a crowd of white men dressed in what somebody described as their Sunday best. And for us to, and you know, just the smiles and the great attempts made by some of them to make sure their faces got in the picture with these two bodies. And we don't have to go to lynchings, and thank God that this group of people won't, but that doesn't mean we don't have to look at lynchings. And hopefully, through the grace of God, this group will.
Okay. Anyone else? Dave.
The thing I'm thinking of kind of now is from what you said, like the CRT freakout, across the country, the clamping down on voting rights is going to be even harder and harder. There's a strong feeling of, I don't know if hopelessness is the right word, or is there, we're like trying to put one finger in a huge dike that's leaking all over the place or something. Is that it's hard to get a feeling for how overwhelming the problem might be, or are we just hearing the loudest, most negative things, and it's kind of just looking for hope, I guess, is the idea. Is there anything there? And this is probably also super wide of, well, I'm supposed to be able to fix it. So I'm probably struggling with that too, but there just seems like this tidal wave of crapola we keep hearing about, and it's man, is this getting better or worse? It's getting, so that's sort of just bring my stream of consciousness there, sorry.
It's a good stream. And it's a good segue. Does anybody else want to? Nancy?
Do you know if there is significant pushback in Florida?
There is pushback in Florida, but it's been signed by the governor. So it's hard to know how that will play out. When I said before, thank you, Mallory. When I said before that it was a very white thing for me to say to seek nonviolence, I say that because I don't want to minimize the anger and rage that live within the depths of the souls of those who have been repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly traumatized. And we can do a whole conversation, probably a whole year's conversation on what nonviolence looks like. So I at least wanted to tap that it is a place of privilege that I stand here and say, yes, be angry, and let's still work towards nonviolence. Okay. I don't have an answer or a definitive. I just said that. And yes, it is a white thing to want to jump in and fix. We do it, right? We do it a lot. And we should figure it out, but not on our terms and not with our agenda. Amir Locke is the young man who was shot dead on his couch by police who were entering his home with a no-knock warrant. And his name was not on the warrant, by the way. And while everybody can say, yeah, but he had a gun, nobody knew he had a gun when he was shot dead. Under a blankets on his couch, minding his business. There will be no charges against the police officer who murdered him, who lynched him. So that is a very little snippet. And I say little because the more often these happen, the less press they get. I want to read you some names and you tell me if they are familiar to you. These are a handful out of about 50, by the way, since 2015. Crystal Daniel Ragland, Luana Phillips, Corinne Gaines, India Kager, Michelle Cousseau. How about Sandra Bland? How about Breonna Taylor? There have been 250 women who have been fatally shot since 2015 by the police. 89 have been shot at their home or at a residence where they might have been staying at that particular time, and about 50 of them were women who were of African descent and who were unarmed. Now, we don't hear much about women in terms of the numbers who have been murdered the same way we hear about, for example, George Floyd. In fact, theory has it we wouldn't have even known about Breonna Taylor, except it happened right after George Floyd, and it was on the minds of everyone else. And it helps that everybody was stuck at home watching TV too, right? Because it was COVID. But the other piece that's really critical to note is that the folks who are crafting the stories are mostly men. Those who are in the media who are crafting the stories that are presented to the general public tend to be male, white or of color, but still that tends to lean towards men. Okay, for those of us who grew up female in this world, we already knew that, didn't we? It's the same as if those who have grown up as of people of African descent already knew everything that you all are learning. Right? For us, it's aha, oh my God, this hurts. And for them, it's thank God somebody finally sees it besides me, because I was going nuts living in a world where most people denied that this trauma and terror ever even happened. But for those of us who are with, we know, we've been in that space where we recognize that 72 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a man gets is still the going rate. And Karima, Latinx women, another 20 cents lower than that. And I can't help making the connection between the chapter that you all read and the fact that it's not much different than some of the biblical stories that we read about. There is a brilliant woman, and I surprised myself and Mallory this morning by learning that she is still on this planet. I don't know why I thought she passed. Her name is Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. She is a theologian and a feminist scholar, not to be confused with a womanist scholar. Womanist scholars are women of African descent, liberation theologists. This woman is clearly of European descent. But she talks about when we interpret the Bible, it's called hermeneutics, interpretation, that we should enter that story with a hermeneutics of suspicion. That we're not reading what we're and asking the question or making the assumption, oh, there are no women here. We should be asking the question of why aren't the women who were there named? That we're reading the story of, for example, Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, hearing about his disciples, and rather than assuming they were all men, asking what were the women doing also? That when we get into Holy Week and we get to Maundy, Thursday, and the Last Supper, we're not asking how come, or we're not noting that there aren't women there. We're asking what were the women also doing there? I promise you the men of that time were not having a meal without women in the room serving it. And I promise you that young men traveling, Jewish men traveling the countryside, were not traveling without women also being with them. And I promise you that civil rights movements and movements to end slavery did not happen without women pushing and prodding the movement. When I was a child, I remember wondering, why is it that while Peter's in the garden, the women are showing up in other places? That women are not in the garden, in the courtyard, not in the garden, denying Jesus. The women are showing up other places. They have shown up in anointing him. They show up on the road, and they show up at the foot of the cross. I don't think as a young child I ever saw a picture of Jesus on the cross in the crucifixion, and Catholics always have Jesus on the cross without the women standing below the cross. Now, I want to be very clear about something. When someone was crucified, nobody was standing below the cross. It was a point of torture and terror so that those who were witnessing it wouldn't go near. It was about annihilating the existence of the person on the cross and leaving them there until their bones were picked clean. Women wouldn't have come near, men wouldn't have come near. They would have been terrified that it was going to happen to them. And yet, every single picture has women showing up. It is countercultural, counterintuitive, counterindicated in what we know about crucifixion, and yet there they are, at the foot of the cross. Jumping ahead, and I won't go too far, when we're reading the stories about the resurrection, guess who the first ones on the scene? But we'll say more about that next week. The women are not just behind the scenes. They are literally pressing the narrative forward, even when they are being, and as they are being written out of the narrative. Because I promise you, the same media giants that decide what the narrative is going to be today are probably related to the ones who decided what was going to be in the Bible back then. But here's what's critical. Both then and now, with all our cultural and gender and even racial advancements, so-called, women are usually identified as the caretakers of the children. They are the ones who usually, if they aren't exactly, assume they are responsible for making sure that the home is a home. I know, vast generalizations, I get it. I'm just putting it out there because I promise you, if I asked you, many of you would still think, yeah, probably so. That's how I was raised. Women are the ones usually that have the talk with their children of color about how to be in the world, how to avoid or appease the police, how to stay away from the Roman centurions, how to avoid saying anything that would offend Caesar. Women of color, indigenous, native, Latinx, of African descent, often remain invisible even as we desperately try to understand the depth and the breadth of racial injustice. And part of the conundrum, too, is looking within individual cultures and noting, well, they don't treat their women well, ergo, not my fault. Again, another really big subject for another conversation. To recognize the risk that it takes to show up at the foot of the cross. And we have to recognize that that risk plays out in a number of ways. The chapter you read about a wife and a mother standing up for her lynched husband cost her her life and the life of her child. The lives of the women who founded Black Lives Matter are constantly receiving death threats, and their program is demonized, as you well know, as something that's marked communist, blah, blah, blah. There is a risk for standing at the foot of the cross. And yet every one of us in this room show up saying we want to follow Jesus, even if it means going to the cross. This work hurts like hell. The work hurts like hell. Not doing the work causes hell. Hurts like hell, causes hell. When Jesus walked into Jerusalem, whether the story of him coming in the other gate is true or not, there was no doubt he wasn't coming out. So now as we enter this week, the holiest of holy weeks, we must ask ourselves, is the pain that we experience by staying in the fight, staying in the work, staying in the discomfort important enough to be in it? Or will we just stay in it this week and then Easter comes? We're good for another year. When we end today, we're going to end a little differently. Historically, we have ended with, were you there? Were you there at the foot of the cross? Were you there when it happened? We've been doing that as our mantra throughout Lent. This year, we will end with the Passion. A little differently than perhaps some of you expect. It will be in a video, and it is somewhat lengthy. It's like a little mini video, and I invite you to stay, and then when you're ready to leave, I ask you to leave silently, just as we would any other Palm Sunday where we've ended with Were You There? So I just want you to know that that's coming as it prepares you for entering this week with intentionality and intention. Amen.